The Last Comanche Chief, The Life and Times of Quanah Parker, Chapter 2, Part 2.
Open hostilities between Anglo-Texans and the people did not begin in earnest until attacks like the one on Parker's Fort in 1836 occurred. If the Texans were angry about Comanche raiders stealing horses or killing cattle on the scattered farms and ranches along the frontier, the capture of their women and children was the last straw, demanding something more than haphazard retaliation by the Rangers. In an attempt to impress upon the Comanches that Texans had sovereign rights over all vacant lands, and that settlers were no longer to be raided and kidnapped by Comanche warriors. President Mirabeau Lamar of the Republic of Texas called for a council with Penateca Comanche chiefs whose bands roamed the Texas Hill Country northwest of San Antonio. The Texan leaders knew that several white prisoners were then being held in Comanche villages along such streams as the Llano and Colorado, and they wanted them back. In March of 1840, Chief Maguara, sometimes spelled Maguara or Muguara, the spirit talker, rode into San Antonio at the head of 65 Indians, including chiefs, women, and children. With them was a white captive, Matilda Lockhart, 16 years of age. If the three commissioners representing the whites in the council about to be held in the courthouse, or council house as it was called, expected the Comanches to bring in all their captives at once, they did not understand Indian trading sense. Ransom for the captives would be greater in the long run if each transaction was handled separately over an extended period of time. Such had been the Comanches' experience with ransoming Mexican captives. But the men Maguara was dealing with now were hard-nosed warriors in their own right. The appearance of the Lockhart girl enraged the Texans. Mrs. Samuel Maverick, who helped bathe and dress her, gave this description of the captive. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and her nose actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale of how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Her body had many scars from the fire. It was sickening to behold, and made one's blood boil for vengeance. The Lockhart girl, having learned the Comanche language in her 2 years with them, revealed their plan to bring in the captives one by one in an effort to exact a higher ransom. In the council house, Chief Maguara, brightly attired and painted for council, demanded high prices for the remaining tithes. He wanted ammunition, vermilion, and blankets. While the discussion was underway, Texas soldiers surrounded the small, one-story limestone building. Indian boys were playing outside, and curious whites were looking on from the street. When asked by the Texas commissioners why the other prisoners had not been brought into San Antonio, Maguara, bald and aged, replied that they were with other bands and could be ransomed later. Then, arrogantly, in the tradition created by generations of Comanche military superiority over their Hispanic foes, the old chief said, "How do you like that answer?" Pale with anger, the commissioners ordered the soldiers into the room. Chief Maguara was told that all the Indians would be held in jail until the other white captives were brought in. As soon as he conveyed this last message, the interpreter ran from the room. War whoops rang out. The Texans opened fire and rifle fire, and smoke filled the room, already a bedlam of Comanche shrieks, and the shouts of the soldiers. One chief killed a soldier who was blocking his exit, but in a short time all the chiefs, including Maguara, were dead, along with the Bexar sheriff and an army officer, and Comanche boys in the street killed a judge who was visiting San Antonio. In the end, all the Indian men were killed, along with some women and children. The survivors were imprisoned. A Comanche woman, widow of one of the chiefs, was given a horse and told to ride out to the bands and tell them they had 12 days to bring the other white captives in, or the Indian prisoners would be killed. 12 days passed, but no white captives appeared. Instead, it was discovered from a white boy who had been adopted by the Indians and later returned to his family. 13 white captives were burned over a fire or killed in other lingering ways. The white children and young women were pegged out naked beside a campfire. They were skinned, sliced, and horribly mutilated, and finally burned alive by vengeful women determined to wring the last shriek and convulsion from their agonized bodies. 10. For months, no road leading to San Antonio was safe to travel. The mutual lack of understanding between Western-thinking whites and the men of the wilderness was never more clearly focused than on that tragic day when the council house erupted into battle. Council was sacred to a Comanche, to talk in time. Of peace, especially after smoking the pipe, meant to tell the truth, and if the truth offended, to agree to war, but to fight in council was to go against the spirit world. Muguara had told the truth, and he had done so with the arrogance the Comanches had long successfully exhibited to Spaniards and Mexicans. Rather than capitulating, however, the Texans had fought, thereby assuring the death of the captives they had hoped through the council to save. The loss of their chiefs was a blow to the Penetecas. Debt. Void of leadership and spiritual direction, the enraged warriors swarmed in the hills northwest of San Antonio, confused and uncertain. In their grief, many of them cut their sacred hair. The ritual destruction of the dead chief's horses took 2 days to complete. Within weeks, the Penetecas had disappeared from central Texas to join the people on the Bison Ranges to the northwest. The massacre at the council house poisoned relations between the two peoples for many years. Revenge came with the rising of the full moon of August 1840, when a large band of up to 1,000 warriors under Chief Buffalo Hump killed a number of slaves and white citizens en route to the town of Victoria. After terrorizing the citizens, most of whom had taken cover in their houses, the war party secured several hundred horses from outlying farms and ranches, and captured Mrs. Crosby, granddaughter of Daniel Boone, and her baby at 9 Mile Point. From there, on August 8, the Comanches left their camp on Placido Creek and headed east across the coastal prairie toward the seaside village of Linville. On the way, they killed a man named O'Neill and 2 black men laboring for Major H.O. Watts, mistaking the Indians for friendly Mexicans with horses for sale. The citizens of Linville realized the fearful truth just in time for most of them to escape in boats, riding in shallow water about 100 yards from shore. Major Watts was killed in the water while attempting to escape, and his young bride was captured along with a black woman and her child. With the town deserted, the Comanches were unmolested as they loaded up goods from the well-stocked warehouses. It took several hundred Indians the entire day to pack the horses for their return to the hill country west of Austin and to points hundreds of miles to the north, for this was a unified war party, made up of reinforcements from the northern Comanches in retribution for the Council House massacre. It is likely that Pita Nakona, Quanah's father, participated in the raid. While the people of Linville sat safely in their boats, they had to endure the sight of their homes and all the warehouses but one pillaged and burned. During the night, the jubilant Indians began their return trip to the hill country, following a route that passed up the west side of Garcita Creek, about 15 miles east of Victoria. While the sack of Linville was taking place, the Texans were preparing to ambush the Indians at Plum Creek, a tributary of the Guadalupe River below the present town of New Braunfels. At 19, John Henry Brown was one of the youngest participants in the ensuing battle. In his words, "After rest and breakfast and strengthened by a few recruits, we moved on and camped that night at the old San Antonio crossing of the San Marcos. The 11th was intensely hot, and our ride was chiefly over burnt prairie, the flying ashes being blinding to the eyes, waiting some hours at noon watching for the approach of the enemy. After night, we arrived at Good's Cabin on the Gonzales and Austin Road, a little east of Plum Creek. Here, Felix Huston, general of militia, with his aide James Izzard, arrived from Austin about the same time. We moved 2 or 3 miles and camped on Plum Creek above the Indian Trail. Our united force was then 100 men. We camped at midnight and sent pickets to watch the trail. Men and horses were greatly jaded, but the horses had to eat while the men slept. At daylight, the lookouts rushed into camp and reported that the Indians were about 3 miles below. Soon every man was mounted, with General Felix Houston in command. Upon hearing that a force of 87 volunteers led by Colonel Burleson were galloping toward his command, Houston halted to wait for the reinforcements. Altogether, the Texans would have only 200 men against a force 5 times that size. As Houston's men waited for Colonel Burleson and his men to arrive, they were able to observe the oncoming Comanches from behind a stand of timber, singing and gyrating in diverse grotesque ways, evidencing their great triumph and utterly oblivious to danger. Up to this time, they had lost but one warrior. At the Casablanca, they had killed 20 persons. They had as prisoners Mimesis Watts, Mimesis Crosby and child, and the Negro woman and child. They had about 2,000 captured horses and mules, and an immense booty in goods of various kinds. 12. As soon as Burleson arrived, the Texans advanced at a trot, quickly increasing to a gallop. About 200 yards from the Indians, the whites dismounted on the open plain. As Brown described it, bands of warriors then began encircling us, firing and using their shields with great effect. From the timber, a steady fire was kept up by muskets and some long rifles while about. 30 of our men, still mounted, were dashing to and fro. Among the mounted Indians illustrating a series of personal heroisms worthy of all praise. At last, perhaps half an hour. After dismounting, an Indian chief wearing a tremendous headdress who had been exceedingly daring approached so. Near that, several shots struck him, and he fell forward on the pommel of his saddle, but was caught by a comrade on either side and borne away, evidently dead or dying. For as soon as he was led among his people in the oaks, they set up a peculiar howl when Captain Caldwell sang out, "Now, General, is your time to charge them. They are whipped." The charge was ordered and gallantly made. Very soon the Indians broke into parties and ran fighting all the time. At the Boggy, Branch Creek, quite a number were killed in clusters for 10 or 12 miles. 13, the running fight continued with the Indians' stolen horses and mules scattering in all directions. Mrs. Watts and the black woman were wounded but were rescued. The black woman's child escaped unhurt. Mrs. Crosby was lanced through the heart as she tried to escape into a thicket. Brown estimated the Indian casualties at 86 killed in action, with several others severely wounded. The Indians lost everything. The defeat was unexpected, a surprise, complete and crushing, followed by a great victory over them in the following October near where Colorado City now stands, won by Colonel John H. Moore and his brave volunteers. The Comanches were taught lessons hitherto unknown to them. 14. Curiously enough, the victors of the Battle of Plum Creek drew lots for the captured plunder rather than returning the prop, already to its rightful owners. Brown received for his share a horse, a fine mule, $27 worth of silk, and about $50 worth of other goods for ladies' use. 15. The Southern Comanches, their vaunted power broken by the massacre at Council House and their reversal at Plum Creek, were never again to mount large-scale attacks against the whites, even though they would continue to raid outlying settlements. But the bold warriors of the Arkansas, Canadian, and Washita rivers were to contest the white man for another 35 years for possession of the land. The battle for Comancheria had only begun.
This is the end of Chapter 2, Part 2. Thank you.